a haunted, ostracized widower, his heart a barren landscape sculpted by a grief he could not voice and a shame that clung to him like the alkali dust of the plains, unknowingly purchased a 71-year-old woman, her eyes holding the ancient sorrow of 1,000 sunsets and her spirit as brittle as sun-baked clay, from the leering cruelty of callous, jeering men at a makeshift auction block under a merciless, indifferent sky, and in a single, desperate act of defiant compassion that resonated through the hollow chambers of his own desolate existence, married her before the last crimson streaks of daylight bled into the vast, uncaring darkness, forging a bond in the crucible of their shared despair that would challenge the very foundations of their brutal, unforgiving world. His name was Josiah, and the whispers that followed him were as sharp as shattered glass, each one a fresh incision into a wound that refused to heal. He lived on the fringe, where the town's grudging tolerance ended and the wilderness began, his cabin a testament to solitude, built with hands that knew labor but had forgotten touch. The laughter from the saloon, raw and ugly, reached him even there, a chorus of mockery for the fool who'd taken the bait. They'd called her Grandma, their voices thick with derision, pushing her forward, a frail figure in a tattered shawl, her face a roadmap of hardship, her body stooped with the weight of years and indignities yet untold. Josiah had seen not a joke, but a desecration. He'd seen the flicker of terror in her faded eyes, the tremor in her hands, the stubborn set of a jaw that refused to completely surrender. The price was a pittance, paid in silent contempt for the sellers, not for the woman. He led her away, her steps hesitant, unsure, a dry leaf skittering before a relentless wind, the jeers of the townsfolk a fading, bitter stain on the air. The preacher, a man whose piety was as thin as his hair, mumbled the vows with ill-concealed distaste, eager to be rid of the spectacle. Josiah's responses were gruff, barely audible, but his grip on her arm, meant to steady her, was unexpectedly gentle. Her name, he learned later, whispered like a rustle of dry grass, was Ilara. And as the stars began to prick the vast, inky canvas above, two souls, adrift in a sea of loneliness, stood yoked together by a cruel prank and a desperate, unspoken plea for something more than survival. The silence in his small, rough-hewn cabin was a living thing, pressing in from all sides, amplifying the sound of their breathing, the crackle of the meager fire he built in the hearth. He offered her the only chair, a worn, creaky thing, while he stood by the small, grimy window, looking out at nothing. Josiah knew the language of silence, it had been his companion for years, a shroud woven from loss and regret. But Ilara's silence was different. It was not the quiet of a man communing with his ghosts, but the frozen stillness of a creature cornered, expecting a blow. He laid out a plate with a piece of dried meat and a hunk of stale bread, placing it on the small, unsteady table. He didn't speak, didn't look directly at her, aware that his gaze, however unthreatening he intended it, might feel like another violation. He retreated to his own cot in the corner, turning his back, a gesture of respect, of granting her the illusion of privacy in the cramped space. Hours passed. The fire dwindled to embers, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed on the walls like tormented spirits. He heard no movement, no sound of eating. When dawn, grey and cold, crept through the cracks in the walls, the food lay untouched. Her eyes, when he finally chanced a look, were fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin, beyond the harsh, unforgiving landscape. They were wells of sorrow, yes, but also of an unnerving, profound endurance. He understood then that this was not a simple rescue, it was a vigil. He was bearing witness to a spirit that had been battered but not broken. The first few days passed in this heavy quietude. He would leave food, fetch water, mend the holes in the cabin roof, all with a deliberate, almost exaggerated slowness, giving her space, giving her time. He never asked her name again, waiting for her to offer it, if she ever chose to. He called her Nam in his mind, a mark of a respect he felt keenly, a respect that the world had so brutally denied her. The town remained a distant, hostile entity. Once, when he had to go in for meager supplies, the storekeeper, a man named Henderson with eyes like a nervous rabbit, had slid his goods across the counter with a smirk. Enjoying married life, Josiah, he'd sneered, his voice loud enough for the other loafers in the store to hear. Josiah had merely fixed him with a flat, cold stare that promised nothing pleasant, and the smirk had faltered. He collected his things and left, the snickers following him out like a pack of curs. He knew they were watching, waiting for him to break, to cast her out, to admit their cruel jest had landed. He would give them no such satisfaction. His protection of her, this silent, stubborn defense, became a wall around his own shattered heart, the first mortar laid in a long-abandoned fortress. He found a tattered quilt in an old chest, one his first wife had made, its colors faded but its stitching still strong. He laid it gently over Ilara one evening as she sat, still as stone, by the dying fire. He expected nothing, no acknowledgement, but as he turned away, he thought he saw her hand, gnarled and thin, reach out and touch the fabric, a fleeting, almost imperceptible caress. It was the first sign, a crack in the ice. Weeks bled into a month, each day a careful repetition of the last. The harsh sun beat down on the parched earth, and the wind whispered lonely lamentations through the sparse, twisted trees that dotted the landscape around Josiah's isolated homestead. He had fashioned a small, sturdy stool for Ilara, placing it in the sliver of shade cast by the cabin's overhang during the hottest part of the day. She would sit there for hours, her gaze fixed on the distant, hazy mountains, her hands lying still in her lap. He noticed she had started to eat a little, small, bird-like portions when she thought he wasn't looking. He never commented, merely ensured there was always something palatable, however humble. He found a patch of wild mint growing near the dry creek bed and started brewing a weak tea, leaving a cup for her. One morning, he found the cup empty, washed, and placed neatly back on the table. It was a communication, a silent thank you that resonated louder than any spoken word. The shame of his past, the event that had driven him to this self-imposed exile, was a constant, dull ache. He had been part of a posse, years ago, green and eager. Ambushed. Men fell. He'd frozen, hidden while others fought and died. The brand of cowardice, though perhaps only perceived by him with such intensity, had seared itself into his soul. This act with Ilara, this quiet shouldering of another's burden, felt like the first honest thing he'd done since. He was not saving her to save himself, not consciously, but her presence, her silent endurance, was slowly chiseling away at the stone of his own despair. He began to talk, not to her directly at first, but to the air around her, narrating his chores, commenting on the weather, the way a hawk circled overhead. His voice was rusty, like an old hinge, but the words came, simple and unadorned. Fence needs mending by the north pasture, he'd say, or looks like rain might finally come. She never responded, but he sensed a subtle shift in her stillness, a listening. One afternoon, as he was repairing a loose board on the porch, he fumbled, dropping his hammer. Before he could retrieve it, a small, wrinkled hand reached down, picked it up, and offered it to him, handle first. Her eyes met his, just for a fleeting second, and in their depths, he saw not fear, but a flicker of something else, awareness, perhaps even a nascent trust. He took the hammer, his calloused fingers brushing hers. "Thank you," he mumbled, the words feeling foreign and momentous. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod and retreated to her stool. The air in the cabin felt different that night, less heavy, the silence less oppressive. It was as if a single, tentative thread had been spun between them, fragile yet undeniably there. The men from the town, however, had not forgotten their cruel entertainment. Their shadows, long and menacing in the late afternoon sun, fell across the yard one day. Jedediah Stokes, the ringleader of the auction mockery, a burly man with a face like a clenched fist and eyes cold as river stones, stood at their head. "Evening, Josiah," Stokes drawled, his voice thick with malice. "Just checking on the happy couple. See if the old bird's learned any new tricks." Josiah straightened from where he'd been splitting wood, the axe feeling heavy and potent in his hand. He didn't speak, just watched them, his body a study in grim stillness. Ilara, from her seat on the porch, remained motionless, but Josiah sensed the sudden tautness in her, the return of that cornered animal fear. "We hear you're quite the caregiver, Josiah," another man snickered, a weaselly fellow named Pike. "Wasting good food on her, eh? Could have bought yourself a decent bottle for what you paid." Stokes took a step closer. "Maybe we were too hasty. Maybe she's got some value after all. A good laugh, if nothing else. Or perhaps we could find another buyer, eh?" The threat hung heavy in the air, ugly and immediate. Josiah's jaw tightened. "She's my wife," he said, his voice low and dangerous, like the growl of a cornered wolf. "You'll leave her be. You'll leave this place." Stokes laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Wife? Don't make me sick, Josiah. You married to that? Everyone knows you're touched in the head. She's just a stray, and strays can be put down." He spat on the ground near Josiah's feet. "We'll be back, Josiah. And next time, we might not be so neighborly." They turned then, swaggering away, their laughter echoing cruelly across the dusty yard, leaving behind a residue of venom and fear. Josiah watched them go, his knuckles white on the axe handle. When they were out of sight, he let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Ilara. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but her hands, though trembling slightly, were clenched into small fists in her lap. He walked over to her, his shadow falling over her. He knelt, an unaccustomed gesture bringing his face level with hers. "I won't let them hurt you," he said, the words a vow, raw and absolute. For the first time, she looked directly into his eyes, a long, searching gaze. And then, she spoke. Her voice, when it came, was like the rustle of autumn leaves, dry and fragile, yet carrying an unexpected strength. "They are cruel," she whispered, each word an effort. It was the most she had said, the most he had ever heard her utter. It was an acknowledgement, a shared truth, a confirmation of the bond their ordeal had forged. He saw then, in the depths of her ancient eyes, not just suffering, but an unyielding will, a spirit that mirrored the stubborn, tenacious life that clung to this harsh, unforgiving land. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. They are. He knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was no longer just his fight. It was theirs. And he would not falter again. The threat from Stokes and his men hung over the small homestead like a gathering storm. Josiah felt it in the uneasy quiet of the nights, in the way the wind seemed to carry their mocking laughter back to him. He reinforced the door, checked the aging rifle he kept above the mantel, its metal cool and grim beneath his touch. He moved with a quiet intensity, his senses sharpened, every rustle of leaves, every distant coyote call, a potential alarm. Ilara watched him, her silence now imbued with a different quality, not fear, but a shared vigilance. She began to move more within the confines of their small world, her steps still careful but less hesitant. One morning, he found she had swept the rough plank floor of the cabin with a makeshift broom of twigs. Another day, she mended a tear in his work shirt with neat, tiny stitches, her gnarled fingers surprisingly deft. These small acts were her contributions to their shared defense, her way of strengthening their fragile fortress. He found a small, smooth piece of charcoal and a flat piece of wood. He drew a crude map of the area around the cabin, marking the creek, the stand of cottonwoods, the game trails he knew. He didn't know why he did it, but he left it on the table. Later, he saw her studying it, her brow furrowed in concentration. The kindness of a stranger, a fleeting moment of light in the encroaching darkness, came unexpectedly. Josiah had ventured into town, a grim necessity, for flour and salt. Henderson, the storekeeper, was alone, his usual sneer absent, replaced by a nervous apprehension. As Josiah paid, Henderson leaned in, his voice low. "Stokes and his boys, they're talking, Josiah. Drunk last night. Said they were gonna teach you a lesson. About respecting your betters. About that woman." He pushed a small, extra sack of coffee beans towards Josiah. "On the house. You best be careful." Josiah met his gaze, saw genuine concern there, a flicker of decency. "Appreciate it," Josiah grunted, taking the coffee. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world, a reminder that not all men were cut from the same cruel cloth. That night, the storm broke. The moon was a pale sliver, obscured by fast-moving clouds. A dog barked frantically in the distance, then fell silent. Josiah was awake, sitting in the darkness, the rifle across his lap. He heard it first, the crunch of boots on gravel, too many to be casual. He rose, moving silently to the window. He could make out 4 figures, moving like shadows towards the cabin. Stokes was in the lead, a heavy club in his hand. "Ilara," Josiah whispered, his voice urgent. "They're here." She was already awake, sitting bolt upright on her cot, her eyes wide in the gloom. He expected terror, paralysis. Instead, she rose, her movement surprisingly swift for her age, and went to the hearth. She grabbed the heavy iron poker, its tip still warm from the banked fire. Her face, illuminated by the faint orange glow, was a mask of grim resolve. There was no fear there now, only a fierce, protective defiance. The first heavy blow landed on the door, shaking the entire cabin. "Josiah! We know you're in there. Send out the old witch, and we might just let you walk away." Stokes's voice was a drunken roar. Another blow, and the wood splintered. Josiah raised the rifle, his aim steady. "This is your only warning, Stokes," he called out, his voice ringing with a cold fury he hadn't known he possessed. "Leave now, or face the consequences." A jeering laugh was his answer, followed by a concerted shove that burst the door inward, hanging precariously on one hinge. Stokes stumbled in, club raised, his face contorted with rage and whiskey. Behind him, Pike and two others crowded the doorway, their eyes glinting with malicious intent. In that instant, as Josiah leveled the rifle at Stokes, a blur of motion came from his right. Ilara, with a cry that was more animal snarl than human sound, swung the heavy poker with all her frail strength. The glowing tip connected with Pike's outstretched arm as he lunged, and he screamed, a high, thin sound, staggering back, clutching his seared flesh. The surprise of her attack, the sheer unexpected ferocity of it, gave Josiah the second he needed. He didn't fire. He brought the butt of the rifle up in a powerful arc, catching Stokes under the chin. The man's head snapped back with a sickening crack, and he crumpled to the floor like a sack of grain, unconscious. The other two, momentarily stunned by the sudden turn of events, hesitated. That hesitation was their undoing. Josiah was on them in a flash, a whirlwind of desperate, righteous fury. He used the rifle like a club, a shield, his movements economical and brutal. He was no longer the hesitant man haunted by past failures, he was a protector, a defender of this small, sacred space, of this woman who had shown him the meaning of courage. He felt a searing pain in his side as one of them landed a glancing blow with a knife, but he barely registered it. He fought with the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose, and everything to gain. Ilara, meanwhile, was not idle. She jabbed and swiped with the poker, keeping the remaining attackers off balance, her small, fierce cries a counterpoint to Josiah's grunts and the thuds of impact. It was a wild, desperate melee in the confines of the small cabin, shadows and figures swirling in the dim light. Finally, it was over. Stokes lay groaning. Pike was nursing his burned arm, whimpering. The other two, battered and bleeding, scrambled back out the broken doorway and fled into the darkness, their bravado shattered. Josiah stood panting, the rifle still gripped tight, his side throbbing. Ilara leaned against the wall, the poker held loosely in her hand, her breathing ragged. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by their harsh breaths and Stokes's moans. Josiah looked at Ilara. Her hair was disheveled, a smear of soot on her cheek, but her eyes blazed with a triumphant fire. He had seen her terror, her sorrow, her quiet endurance. Now, he saw her strength, a force as formidable as any he had ever witnessed. In the crucible of violence, their bond had been forged anew, tempered in fire and sealed in shared defiance. Dawn came, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and hesitant gold. Josiah had tied Stokes securely, his earlier bluster replaced by sullen silence. Pike, his burn crudely bandaged, sat huddled and defeated. The other two were long gone, swallowed by the wilderness they had sought to command. Josiah's side ached, a deep, throbbing pain where the knife had sliced him, but he ignored it as best he could. Ilara, with an efficiency that belied her years, had found clean rags and was tending to his wound, her touch surprisingly gentle, her brow furrowed with concern. Her earlier ferocity was replaced by a quiet solicitude that spoke volumes. He watched her, this woman who had been sold as a cruel joke, this resilient survivor who had faced down violent men with nothing but an iron poker and an indomitable spirit. A wave of emotion, so strong it almost buckled his knees, washed over him, not pity, not even just respect, but a profound, aching tenderness. He had sought to protect her, and in the end, they had protected each other. When the sun was fully risen, Josiah loaded Stokes and Pike onto his old mule. He would take them to the nearest town with a semblance of a marshal, miles away. He didn't expect true justice, but he would see them gone from his life, from Ilara's. Before he left, he turned to her. She stood in the doorway of the battered cabin, the morning light catching the silver in her hair. The lines on her face seemed softer, the ancient sorrow in her eyes lessened, replaced by a quiet strength, a settled peace. "I'll be back," he said, the simple words carrying the weight of a solemn promise. She nodded, a small, dignified inclination of her head. And then, she offered him a rare, hesitant smile, a tiny flicker of warmth that lit up her weathered face like the first flower of spring after a long, hard winter. "Josiah," she said, her voice still quiet, but clear and steady now. Be careful, it was the first time she had used his name. It resonated in the quiet morning air, a symbol of their new understanding, their hard-won connection. He rode away, not looking back, but he carried the image of her smile with him, a talisman against the harshness of the journey ahead. 6 months passed. The cabin was repaired, stronger now, the door new and solid. A small patch of earth beside it had been tilled, and tiny green shoots were pushing their way towards the sun, Ilara's garden. She moved with a new lightness, her steps less hesitant, her presence a quiet hum of life within their shared solitude. She spoke more now, her words still measured, but her voice no longer held the brittle fragility of those first days. She told him stories, fragments of a life lived long and hard, tales of resilience, of loss, of small joys snatched from the jaws of sorrow. He listened, his own silence no longer a wall, but an open space for her voice to fill. He found he could speak too, of his first wife, of his child, memories he had buried deep, the words clumsy at first, but healing in their utterance. The shame of his past had not vanished, but its sharp edges had been worn smooth by the steady rhythm of their shared days, by the quiet dignity of the woman who now shared his life. They were an unlikely pair, the taciturn widower and the elderly woman brought together by cruelty. But in the quiet spaces between their words, in the shared tasks of survival, in the unspoken understanding that flowed between them, they had found something precious, something true. They had found redemption not in grand gestures, but in the small, consistent acts of kindness and respect. They had found love, not the fiery passion of youth, but a deep, abiding affection, a companionship that soothed the old wounds and made the harsh landscape around them seem, finally, like home. The townsfolk left them alone now. The story of the fight had spread, embellished no doubt, but the core truth of their defiance had earned them a grudging respect, or at least a wide berth. Josiah was no longer just the town's fool, he was a man who protected what was his. And Ilara was no longer the old witch, she was the woman who had stood beside him. Their life was simple, unadorned, but it was rich in ways that mattered. It was a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, to the possibility of finding solace and connection in the most unexpected of places, with the most unexpected of souls. He often watched her as she tended her small garden, her face serene in the late afternoon sun, and a quiet joy would fill him, a warmth that spread through his chest like the heat from their small hearth on a cold night. They had faced the darkness together and had emerged, not unscathed, but whole. And so, this tale of a lonely widower and the elderly bride sold to him as a cruel jest, a story born of mockery and despair, transformed into an anthem of resilience, of unexpected love, and the quiet triumph of the human heart against the desolate landscape of cruelty and indifference. It reminds us that dignity cannot be bought or sold, that courage can be found in the most fragile of vessels, and that true connection often blossoms in the spaces where we least expect it, nurtured by compassion and fortified by shared struggle. The world may cast its stones, its judgments, its bitter jests, but the strength to rise above, to find worth in oneself and in another, to build a sanctuary of respect and affection in the ruins of past sorrows, that is a power that resides within us all. They found their peace not in changing the world, but in changing their small corner of it, proving that even in the harshest of winters, the seeds of hope, tended with care, can indeed bloom. Remember their story. Remember that kindness is a rebellion, and love, in all its forms, is the most profound victory. Don't forget to subscribe now, hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next story, and join our campfire as we continue to share tales that stir the soul and remind us of the enduring power of the human spirit.